Welcome to the Developers Integration Lab training and demonstration video for test case configuration. The purpose of this training video is to assist DIL administrators who are users with an admin user role configure test cases. This video is intended for DIL administrators as they are the only users with access to the functions described here. Before you attempt to configure any test cases in the DIL, there are a few things you will need. First, you will need to map out the organization of your test cases into service sets, scenarios, and scenario cases. Next, ensure that you have all the required patient data and patient documents loaded into the DIL. You will need to load this data into the multiple test data environments supported by the DIL. For each test, outline which variables within the request and response message you want to validate. For example, will a subject ID be required for a patient discovery request? What should the test participants see on the test case results page if the subject ID is missing or is incorrect? For each identified variable, consult with the filter set creation team to ensure you know the filter sets, filter templates, and correct format of the parameter values required to ensure the test is configured for your expected results. In this video, we will cover creating service sets, scenarios, scenario cases, and test cases. We will walk through the configuration of a scenario case that includes a patient discovery, query for documents, and retrieve documents test. Each type of test has its own unique configuration considerations. We will configure both initiator and responder versions of the tests so that you can see how the configuration differs. Now let's get started. In the DIL, the highest level of categorization for tests is a service set. A service set is a collection of scenarios. A scenario is a collection of scenario cases, and a scenario case is linked to a test case. The categorization of test cases into scenarios and service sets is user-defined and best done prior to starting data entry in the DIL. During this video, we will create a single service set with two scenarios, an initiator and a responder scenario. Within each scenario, there will be three scenario cases: a patient discovery, a query for documents, and a retrieve document scenario case. Each scenario case will be linked to a test case with a description of the test and the expected results. Once you have decided how your test cases will be organized into scenarios and service sets, you can start your data entry in the DIL. The first step is to create the service set. Log into the DIL with your administrator credentials. Click the service set hyperlink from the left-hand menu. Click New Service Set. Enter the name of your service set. We know that our example service set will include both initiator and responder scenarios, so we will leave both of these boxes checked. Always set SSN handling to yes. You can make this service set active or disabled. If the service set is active, it will be visible to external test participants. If you make it disabled, you can still continue with your configuration and execute the tests in this service set. However, neither the service set nor any of the scenarios in it will be available for outside testing. We will make our example service set disabled so that we can configure it and test it before allowing external test participants to access it. Set Enforce Unique Patient ID to yes. Click Save Changes. A scenario is a collection of scenario cases. When you are ready to execute a scenario, you can execute all the scenario cases within a single scenario with one click of a button. You can also create dependencies between scenario cases within a scenario. A scenario can include both initiator and responder scenarios. These options may inform which scenario cases you wish to include in a scenario. Let's create our example initiator scenario first. Enter the name of your scenario. You can also include a quick name, a description, and a condition. Usually the condition field tells the tester what data is required in order to execute the test. In our example, the scenario will include initiator tests only. Always set SSN handling to yes. The status can remain as active even though we are not finished configuring and internally testing our new tests. Because the service set is disabled, none of the scenarios or scenario cases within the service set will be accessible to external participants, even if those scenarios are active. Now that we have our service set and scenario, we are ready to create a scenario case. The scenario case stores the bulk of the details for the test. This screen is where you define the patient associated with the test, the contents of the request message generated by the DIL, and the filters or rules that will be applied to the request and response messages. We will start with a patient discovery initiator test. We will configure a test case where we expect the system under test to send a request message to the DIL with a minimum set of patient information, namely a living subject ID, the living subject name, the living subject gender, and the living subject date of birth. We will configure the test case to confirm that the DIL correlates the correct patient ID and generates a valid response. Let's go through the scenario case screen in detail, since this is where the majority of our configuration will take place. There are a number of ways to navigate to this screen. When creating a new scenario case, the most efficient way is to navigate as we have in this video, from the scenario screen. By accessing the scenario case in this way, the service set and scenario fields are already populated for us. Specify the message type for this scenario case. In this example, we are creating a patient discovery, so the message type we want is NHIN-PD. We must associate the scenario case with a test case. A test case is a description of the scenario case. You can use an existing test case by selecting one from the drop-down. But for our example, we are going to create a new test case. Enter the name of your test case. Enter a description of the test case. System owned will default to yes and does not need to be changed. The message is the type of message tested in this scenario. In this example, we want to choose NHIN patient discovery. The default values for test type and execute type fields do not need to be modified. Specify if the test case is an initiator or responder test case. In this example, we are creating a patient discovery initiator test case. Always set SSN handling to yes. In the expected results field, enter a general description of the expected results. As stated before, we expect a successful match for patient 2. After saving the test case, click Close to return to the scenario case screen. Note that our newly created test case is automatically populated in the test case field on the scenario case screen. The lab RIs, or reference implementations, specify in which environment the test will run. These RIs are specific to the DIL and each runs a different version of a Connect gateway. There are also RIs specific to certain certificate tests. It is important to know which RI is configured for a specific test, as this determines the endpoints that the test participant will need to use when initiating from the system under test. A single scenario case can be associated with multiple RIs. We will configure our example scenarios to run in RI4. The patient ID must be selected. The patient ID listed in the drop-down is the DIL generic patient ID. Test participants will have mapped these IDs to their own MPI. Note that within a service set, you cannot have the same patient ID associated with multiple tests for the same message type. This is another piece of information that may determine how you categorize your service sets, scenarios, and scenario cases. The description field will populate automatically from the data entered in the scenario case. You may also manually enter a description. If you would like the description to be populated automatically after you have made changes to the scenario case, delete the contents of the description field and click Update. For an initiator scenario, the system under test will send the request message. The message defined here for an initiator scenario is the message the DIL will generate when testing the scenario internally. It will not be used when an external test participant executes the test. You can try to define a message from scratch, but that is a lot of unnecessary work. The best approach is to select a template. We have a number of known good templates that can be used as the basis for a test message. Once you have selected your template, you will notice that the Form Content and XML Content tabs are populated. The form content tabs allow for easier manipulation of the XML content through a user-friendly interface. For most of the tests you will configure, the data elements you need to update can be found in the Control Acknowledgement Process / Query Parameters section of the Form Content tab. We are configuring a patient discovery scenario case for patient 2. In the Form Content tab, we want to enter the specific values for patient 2. The patient data can be found in the patient file in the DIL. At this point, the scenario case has been created. The description has been populated for us, and the XML content has been updated with the information we entered into the Form Content tab. Now we can apply filters to the scenario case. A scenario case can be executed without filters. However, if no filters are applied, the default status for the test is pass. This can be misleading if you have not specified any rules to apply to the request and response messages. In order to use the DIL to your advantage, you should apply filters to the scenario case so that you can easily identify test failures and feel confident that when you do see a pass status, it is because you configured the test case to meet your expected results. The filters allow you to specify what elements of the request and response message will determine the pass or fail status of this test. You will need some background information on the filter set and filter template configuration in order to select the correct filters and enter the correct parameter values. Filters are created and maintained by administrators with knowledge of XSLT and XML coding. Please check with the filter set creation team to confirm which filters you will need for a particular test. In our example, we want to ensure that the patient discovery request message includes a subject ID, the gender, the date of birth, and the name for patient 2. In order to verify that these elements are present on the request message, we will add filters to the test case to check for these elements and the specific values for the patient associated with this test. As you recall, this is an Initiator test case. This means that a system under test will be sending a patient discovery request to the DIL. We want to confirm that the request includes a subject ID. However, we cannot specify a value in the filter parameter as this value will be different for each system under test. The DIL has a number of placeholders to use in these situations. We can enter the value participant patient ID in the living subject ID filter parameter value in order to validate that the living subject ID included in the request matches the patient ID mapped to patient 2 on the participant info screen. We also want to verify that the response from the DIL has the correct patient ID. Because this is an Initiator scenario and the DIL will be the responder, we know what the patient ID will be in the response message. The patient ID included in patient discovery responses from the DIL is a concatenation of the RI for this test and the generic patient ID. So in this example, the expected patient ID is RI0004 dot and then the generic patient ID for patient 2. sure to activate the filter set and all the applicable filter templates by checking the box next to each. Note that if you delete a filter template from a scenario case, it can only be added back to the scenario case by deleting the entire filter set and reselecting the filter set. Now we are ready to execute our test to verify it has been configured correctly. In order to execute a test, you will need to log into the DIL as a test participant. I will go through these steps fairly quickly. Additional training videos are available that walk through test case execution in more detail. The current result of the test case is pass, which is what we want. Now let's verify that all our filters have the correct output. We can see that all the filters we expected to be applied are present. If you do not see one of the filter sets or templates you expected, check your test case configuration to ensure it's activated. If at least one filter status value was fail, the overall status of the test case will be fail. Note that the filter output for the Subject ID Validator filter tells us the specific subject ID found in the request message. This value will be different for each system under test, which is why we used our participant patient ID placeholder. We can also see that the request message has the expected gender, date of birth, and subject name. As indicated by the response message filter, the patient has been successfully correlated to the expected patient ID. Given our test configuration, these are exactly the results that we wanted. Now let's configure a query for documents initiator scenario case for the patient that we just successfully correlated. As you recall during our exercise to create the patient discovery scenario case, the easiest way to navigate to the scenario case screen is from the service set screen. Because our service set already exists, we can click the name of the service set from the service set list. We have also already created the scenario that we need, so we can click on the name of the scenario from the service set's attribute screen. Here we will click New Scenario Case to create our new query for documents scenario case. By accessing the scenario case screen in this way, the service set and scenario fields are already populated for us. We are creating a query for documents scenario, so the message type we want is NHIN-QD. Once again, we are going to create a new test case. Just as we did for the patient discovery test case, we will enter a name and description for this test case. The message is going to be NHIN query for documents. And as stated before, we expect a response with approved documents for patient 2. Once again, our newly created test case is automatically populated in the test case field on the scenario case screen. As you recall, our example scenarios will run in RI4. Our patient ID must be selected. Now let's define our message content that will be used for internally testing this initiator scenario case. Select a known good template for a query for documents scenario case. Note that the Form Content tab is different for the Query for Documents message. The form content varies based on the type of message specified for the scenario case. In the Form Content tab, we want to specify that we are looking for approved documents. Note that in order to test this initiator scenario internally, patient documents must have been loaded in the DIL through the Documents interface. At this point, the scenario case has been created. The description has been populated for us, and the XML content has been updated with the information we entered into the Form Content tab. Now we can apply filters to the scenario case. In our example, we want to ensure that the Query for Documents request message includes a patient ID and a status of approved. Note that we can specify the DIL patient ID in the patient ID filter parameter value. Because this is an initiator scenario and the DIL has responded to a prior patient discovery for this patient, subsequent Query for Documents and Retrieve Documents request messages are expected to include the DIL patient ID. As a reminder, the format of the parameter values should be confirmed with the filter set creation team prior to configuring your filters. In the response, we will verify that the documents we expected are returned in the response. Because this is an initiator test and the DIL will be responding, we know the specific document IDs that the DIL should return in the response. Once again, be sure to activate the filter set and all the applicable filter templates by checking the box next to each. Now we are ready to execute our Query for Documents test to verify the configuration. Let's log into the DIL as a test participant and quickly verify the results of our new Query for Documents test. Hopefully these steps are familiar, as these are the same steps we went through to verify the output of our patient discovery test. Remember that we entered 4 document IDs in our response filter. The test case current results summary page only displays the first line of the filter output message. We can click on the filter output hyperlink to view additional details. Excellent. Now let's configure a Retrieve Documents test to get the actual documents that were identified in our Query for Documents response. Let's navigate to the scenario case screen. We are creating a Retrieve Documents scenario, so the message type we want is the NHIN RD. Once again, we are going to create a new test case. Just as we did for the patient discovery and Query for Documents test cases, we will enter a name and description for this test case. The message is going to be NHIN Retrieve Documents. Be sure to indicate that this is an initiator test case and that SSN handling is yes. For the Retrieve Documents, we will request all 4 documents for this patient, so we expect to receive all 4 attachments in the response. Once again, our newly created test case is automatically populated in the test case field on the scenario case screen. Our example scenarios will run in RI4. Our patient ID must be selected. And we want to select a known good template for a Retrieve Documents scenario case. Once again, the Form Content tab is specific to the message type for this test. For this test, we will request all 4 documents found in the Query for Documents test. A placeholder can be used for the home community ID. The DIL has only 1 repository and the ID is 1. And because this is an initiator scenario and we have provided the DIL document IDs to the system under test, the request message should include the specific document IDs. Now we can apply filters to the scenario case. We want to validate that the request coming from the system under test includes requests for all 4 documents. We also want to validate that the response from the DIL includes all 4 documents. Don't forget to activate your filter sets and filter templates. And now we are ready to validate our retrieved document test case configuration. Let's log into the DIL again as a test participant and view the results of our retrieved documents test case execution. For a retrieved documents test, you want to verify that the filter output is what you expect. And you also want to validate that the documents you expect are in the Documents Retrieved section of the test case current results summary page. Our results look good. Now that we have completed the Initiator scenario, scenario cases, and scenario test configuration, let's take a look at responder test cases. You may be wondering why we are going to review creating the same types of tests, patient discovery, query for documents, and retrieve documents, for a responder. Although the steps are the same, the XML content and the expected results for the filters are different, and can be a cause of confusion if you are not familiar with the differences between Initiator tests and responder tests. We will move quickly through the configuration of the responder tests, stopping only to discuss variations on what we have already learned. For the responder test cases, we will configure all 3 test cases prior to executing any of them to confirm the configuration. Let's create the responder scenario in our training service set first. As you may recall, a scenario is a collection of scenario cases. In our example, we are creating another scenario just for our responder scenario cases. Now let's create our first responder scenario case, the patient discovery responder scenario case. Hopefully these steps look familiar to you. The main difference between a responder scenario and an initiator scenario in the DIL is that in the responder scenario, the DIL is the initiator and the system under test is the responder. This means that the request messages defined here in the XML content and form content tabs are the messages that will be sent to an external system under test when this test case is executed. The system under test will generate a response that will be sent back to the DIL. We are using the same filters as we did for the initiator scenarios. However, the parameter values will be different since the actors have changed places. In the responder scenario, the request filter validates the request message sent by the DIL, and the response filter validates the response message sent by the system under test. In this patient discovery responder scenario, the expected subject ID in the request is the DIL subject ID. We will use our participant patient ID placeholder in the response filter for this responder scenario. Remember that this placeholder allows us to use a filter to validate that a patient is correlated and a patient ID is returned in a response without knowing the specific ID, as it will vary for each system under test. We can navigate back to the scenario screen by closing this scenario case screen. Then we can click New Scenario Case to start our Query for Document scenario case. Hopefully you're getting the hang of this by now. Because the system under test has responded to the DIL's patient discovery with that system's patient ID, and because the DIL must use that ID in the Query for Documents request, we will use the participant patient ID placeholder to ensure we send the correct ID, which again can vary by system. Given the nature of the format for the Query for Documents patient ID, we must also use a placeholder for the system under test assigning authority ID. The response will be coming from the system under test, which means the test participant will be providing their own document IDs, which vary by system. Therefore, we cannot enter a specific ID in the parameter value for the document unique ID filter for a responder scenario. We can utilize a basic filter that checks for the presence of at least one document. This filter does not require a parameter value. Simply activating the filter will execute the logic of the filter template. The last test we want to configure is a Retrieve Documents responder scenario case. We will configure the test case to retrieve the first document we expect from the Query for Documents test. If you want to request more than one document, you can add additional document request slots through the Form Content tab. Because we must generate a response from the DIL with participant information, we will need to use placeholders for the Home Community ID, Repository Unique ID, and Document ID. Again, we must use placeholders to validate any participant-specific data in this responder scenario. Placeholders used in the filter configuration are different from the placeholders used in the Form Content tab. When multiple documents are being requested, the last digit of the Repository Unique ID and Document Unique ID placeholders should increment. Now we are ready to test our configuration. Let's log into the DIL as a test participant and execute our responder scenarios. In our patient discovery test, we can see where the filter output has replaced our placeholder with the test participant patient ID. In the Retrieve Documents Responder test, we can also see the participant-specific data in the filter output. Another successful test. This concludes the training and demonstration video for test case configuration. Thank you for listening.